Greetings, fellow 631 classmates for Law and Policy. This is John Cabell providing you with a bit of my uh, reading presentation for policy frames and market forces as found in the textbook. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit of some of the highlights, the key points, and things that I got out of this I think that are worthy and valuable for us as we look forward into the remainder of this class. In providing a bit of a synopsis for the reading, the book was excellent and provided a very good overview of the history of the shifts in public policy from one of being very socially focused progressive values and the focus on the greater good of education to more of a very more neoliberal, neoconservative, conservative-minded model in that one of the purposes of education is to benefit the individual, not necessarily benefit society as a whole. So you've got two factions, basically. You've got the liberals, or more liberal viewpoint, who are looking at it and saying education is for the greater good and the greater contribution towards society, where you have the conservative mindset being a little bit more shifting towards this is about the individual accomplishment and focusing on the individual person. This chapter also really does a good job of outlining those social political agendas, looking at the involvement of social and political agendas together to meet those needs of more of the individualistic political agendas. The book does offer a lot of great terms, which are going to be very important throughout the remainder of the book. So I've taken the liberty of grabbing some of those, probably not all inclusive and all exhaustive, but providing a good list of the glossary that we're going to need, I think, as we look forward and start to mentally digest and interpret the textbook as we continue forward, not just the text, but looking at any public policy that we might come across. The book does a good job of explaining the structure of policy analysis of what they're going to use in this book. They use what's called a critical empirical approach, and I will describe that in the glossary of terms in the next couple of slides. But the book does lay out how they're planning to move forward in doing their own policy analysis as they provide those case studies. The chapter also does a really good job of discussing what policy frames, the trends, and a research base as they, in the latter part of the chapter, when they're looking for specific links between what are the policies that are looking to be implemented and how do we actually determine whether or not those are considered successful, or do they have the outcomes and do they address the issues that were originally intended for them. In terms of looking for the key concepts, the chapter really does a good job of looking at political agendas and looking at the policy makers using facts, and I have facts in quotes because one person's or one agenda facts may not be another person or agenda's facts. So there's a lot of utilization of numbers to advantages. I think we can say that statistics can pretty much say anything we want them to depending on how we spin them. So I think we're going to see a good bit of this as we look forward into public policy as we continue in this course and in our personal and professional lives. The social and political process is a factor in public policy, and higher level decision making is critical as well, because this is going to look at, and this is for us to understand, what are the larger factors at play when you look at political processes. These things are not being made in a vacuum, they're being made with the greater social good in consideration of that. However, we have to critically look at and say, which social good? Is it for neoliberal, neoconservative mindsets? Is it for more on the liberal viewpoint of the greater good of education for society and access and affordability? You'll hear me talk about money in a little bit. Originally, when the text kind of starts out, not just this chapter, but in books leading up to this and the other readings we've gotten, education was really seen as a greater good, and that's where America really started the trend early, was by proposing that the greater good, we need to be educated, so therefore individuals were pushed to go to college. Tuition was at a very affordable rate, but we're seeing that as a shift, obviously, in latter years, with tuition increases being as quickly rising as they are. So that shifts us towards education being considered more by some as a private good in more years. So the question we weigh within our minds is education a public good? Is it a private good? Is it a combination of the two? Where do we stand and where do we think on those things as we look forward? The textbook also does a really good job of telling us that you need and we need to look at things in a very neutral light through those critical empirical methods. We need to investigate and look and say, does this make sense? Are we looking at it from a biased perspective? Having taken Dr. Candace Thompson's course, she really talked to us about our own narratives, and we are a product of who we are and our experiences, and we bring those to the table, and we can't escape our narratives, but we have to keep those things in perspective when we're looking at other things to say, is this because of the way that I was raised, or is this because of the way that I think, and do I need to lower my defenses and say, here are some other things I need to consider when looking forward at some other things. And lastly, one of the key concepts is looking at the links between support and student success. What impacts what? Does affordable college, does that lead itself that students are going to be able to get to college? Are they going to seek those institutions that have more affordable, merit-based or need-based scholarship opportunities? Are they going to look at a lower accredited school because those things are more available to them, and do they then give themselves a shortchanging of education at that point? So I want to talk about the glossary. I know that it's not intentional to spend a great deal of time talking about the text itself, but this chapter is so foundational for where we move forward that skipping the glossary as a communal piece would be a disservice to everyone. So one of the things first it talks about is the policy frames, and the text says it's logic structures used in political processes to rationalize advocacy for policy decisions, and that's looking at the greater concept of the policy frames is, what are those logic structures being used? How are we developing policies? How are we arguing and saying this is the right thing to do? So that becomes those policy frames. The market forces are prevailing or rising trends. Oftentimes are related to the economy, but in our case, it's relating a lot to the world of higher education. So what is a dominant or prevailing wind, as it were, and where is the wind taking us? That critical empirical approach I talked about was breaking down the assertions and looking at evidence and information objectively. How do we escape our own narrative, and how do we look at things through a very fresh lens as they relate to those assertions, and then how do we develop our own sense of understanding based on the information we're doing. So when we're looking at public policy, it's not looking at it and saying, well, I can't agree with that, I'm on the opposite party line. It is a matter of looking at it and saying, does it make sense? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Is it logical? Is it going to make an impact? Are we going to see positive outcomes, hopefully, from those things? The text talks about globalization, which I put together and said the emerging of international business, education, and social context, basically making the world a global village. We are huge, but we're getting smaller through our ability to communicate across boundaries and our ability to virtually connect, especially through electronic means. It's just, the world is getting smaller, but it's expanding at the same time, but still getting smaller. Privatization, in the context of the book, it said the shifting of a larger share of the burden of funding higher education from taxpayers to students and their families. When tuition was initially low, colleges, students and parents were able to afford college much more easily, but now the government has shifted less from grants to students and more to loans to students. So that's placing that burden much more on the individual students and their need and their families' needs to pay for their college education. Some additional glossary terms: the social political process. It's a combination of both the social and political factors. This text discusses a lot of the social political process as the involvement of lobbying by interest groups, construction of rationale, and implementation of policies through annual budgeting. So we're seeing a merging of social, merging of political, and an outcome of how are things being done. And oftentimes we see that through where money is going. The policy rationale, which is the text says, is arguments developed through political agendas that use research to advocate for reform. The question that we need to do as doctoral students and critical empirical policy reviewers is we have to think critically and say, is the research agency that's doing this, are they doing it and advocating for something because it's ultimately benefiting them, or is it a neutral third party that's conducting a policy analysis? So we've got to be critical and not just say, thank you for the information. We need to say, where's the information coming from and how do we know that it's objective? The proofiness, I love this term, that it was simply called fibbing with numbers, and that goes back to the statistics that say we can make statistics say anything we want to. So fibbing with numbers, otherwise known as proofiness. The Pathway to College Framework, PCF, great chart that's on page 45 of the textbook. It centers on the ways public finance and education politics link to educational attainment. We are all in it, I believe, to see success of our students, so we're looking to see what's that pathway to college pipeline that's going to be beneficial and lead ultimately to our students' success. And then we have Academic Capital Formation, ACF. This one is important. I had to read this a couple times to really let it hit home with me, but this is a focus on first-generation college students, and this is looking at their ability to A, learn about college, B, make it through college, be academically successful, and C, graduate and contribute to the greater good through their own actualization, understanding the impact they can make after they graduate from college. So that was a listing of glossary terms that I think are really critical for us to understand. The importance of this reading is really a primer to understand the rest of the book. This sets up the book for us and looking at the lens through which we're going to see the impact of that public policy in our worlds of higher education. It lays the groundwork, and as the education term is, it gives us the scaffolding for the rest of the book, so it's really important for us to understand those terms that I just covered in the glossary. And then it's also going to outline the need to look critically. We need to use that critical empirical approach to look at politics, political agendas, what are the intended outcomes of public policy, and what are the actual impact of those policies. So some things to consider. Think about the history and shift from social progressive to more conservative values. How do we get from there to here? That decrease in funding from grants to loans, understanding that framework of the pathway to college success. What can we ultimately do to help our students be successful? Thinking about the role of local versus state versus federal influence and governance in higher education. The impact of politics and political agendas. I think we are all savvy enough to understand that their politics exist everywhere, especially more so in the educational environment, and we follow the money. It's very important to look at it and say, where is money coming from, where is it going to? So I want to throw to us 3 questions to consider, and I'll read these as, in what ways have our own personal educational experiences, those personal narratives, and our current work settings in education shaped us, and how we think about education reforms pertaining to college preparation, access, and success. So I throw that out for a question in this debate, and I'll be glad to mediate and facilitate some conversations on that. Second is, do you all think, is education more a public good or a private benefit to those who pursue educational degrees? And depending on your response, in what way should the federal government be more or less involved in education policy and decision making? It could be increased or decreased. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And then 3, reflecting on your response to the first 2 questions. How and in what ways can we open our minds to look objectively about preparation, access, and success of college students? So I offer these 3 questions for us to consider as we move forward and looking at this specific text, and also as we go forward and looking at all public policy. So I want to also add a reference, public policy in higher education. I do appreciate you all taking the time to listen to this video clip, and I wish you all a great session. I look forward to hearing responses to those questions.